We're going to take a look at the Middle East now in the modern period since 1945, and we'll probably go back to World War I to understand the roots of what's going on today. The Middle East is a very complicated area and has a lot of different factors that make this one of the most unstable areas, area filled with conflict, and very complicated politically. Well, we'll take a look in a moment at how this can be traced back to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We've talked about the Ottoman Empire before, and as it's falling apart, getting weak in the 19th century, it'll fall apart in the early 20th century, especially following World War I. This is going to bring in new factors, for example, European control, mostly British and French, although others get involved as well. This brings about local nationalism. It was already there. This area had been controlled by the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, for many years. And once it fell apart, many of them had hopes they would be independent. And then the Europeans come in and take control. Well, after World War II, when the Europeans will withdraw from the area, pretty much forced to by World War I and World War II, you'll now have several new countries that are formed during this period. Countries like Egypt and Jordan, Iraq, Syria. These will all have one thing in common. They are newly formed. They are rather dependent economies. Militarily, they're dependent on the West, most of them, although they are, of course, now in the midst of the Cold War as well. But there are other factors that might be unique to this area that we don't see in other former colonial areas. And I list 5 here. Maybe there could be more. But certainly oil becomes a big factor. Oil is discovered mostly in the 1930s. And of course, this is just when oil is needed. There wasn't a high consumption of oil until we had automobiles. And of course, automobiles do not become widespread until the early 20th century, in the teens, around World War I, and then growing from there. And so oil becomes increasingly important for gasoline and other petroleum products. This is going to bring a great amount of wealth, especially in the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf areas like Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait, Iraq. We'll talk about that in a moment. There is, of course, a growing pan-Islamic movement. By that I mean those who want to unite all Muslims together, perhaps in one large nation, but certainly tying them together not only religiously but politically, and that's going to come into play in these new countries. The Zionist movement had been growing. The Zionist movement is a push for Jews to move to Zion, or to what will be called Israel, to have a homeland here in the Middle East. Most of these Zionists are from Europe. They're European Jews, to some extent American Jews will get involved, but this sort of begins in the 19th century, begins to grow. And so this movement to have a homeland in the Middle East is also going to complicate things, because they'll be moving into areas that are primarily Arab, and a lot of them Muslim Arabs. There are Christian Arabs as well, but this really complicates the issue. So we're going to see this will lead to the last one on the list here, the issue of Palestine, what's going to happen there. And then I've added technology, I think, because growing in the 20th century, we know technology grows, telephones, television, but increasingly now in the past several years, the growth of the internet, cell phones, social media, these all are having a profound impact on the Middle East, as I suppose they are elsewhere too. But this allows, in the past, before you had, say, cell phones, a lot of communication and the internet, a lot of communication could be kept from people. There could be censorship and monitoring. But now, of course, it's surprising to me to see just, proliferation of cell phones, because those communication had always been controlled in the Middle East. Now it's basically out of control in many ways, although they do try to shut down some access to the internet and so forth. But this has changed things as well. Just information coming in, communication is there. Now I want to show you a series of maps, diagrams, charts, and just try to talk through them to explain this area, and then we'll have a few things after that as well. So let's take a look at the first one. Now this one could be overwhelming. It's a guy put this together, I think a British journalist, I'm not sure. And actually if you go to the website, you can roll your mouse over different countries and so forth, and it shows the connections. You certainly that you might be interested to do that, but I just wanted to show you the web of connections as I see it, say between the United States and all of these different countries, Russia, Germany, the UK, and then of course all the different players. For example, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, all of these interconnections that you see there. And then, of course, added to that would be, things like Hamas and Hezbollah and over here, the Taliban. It makes it very, very complicated. Obviously, in what we're doing today, we're not going to sort all that out. People have studied this for many years and still are amazed at the complexity of it. But it is, I'm just showing you this to let you see it's a complex area with a lot of interconnections. For example, up here is Al-Qaeda, right? And now other players are getting involved, like China. China never had much to do earlier, but they certainly do today. India as well, getting involved. And so let's move to the next one. This is just showing you in part what I was telling you about, maybe relating to technology, but also is education levels. This is just a map that shows you by percentage the number of people who can read and write, literacy rates. And just showing you, this was done, I believe, around 2017, 2016, so it's a couple of years old, but it's showing you now the percentages. And, of course, comparing it, the difference between, say, 15 to 24-year-olds today in this part of the world to those who are 65 and older. So notice the increase, and you see it by the colors, is sort of darker blue. I think they're up into the 90 percentile. The lighter blue is in the 80 percentile, 70, and even a lighter blue in the 70s. But take a look at this, and you can see a dramatic shift from here, people over 65, 14, 16%, 3%, and so forth. You can see 55% here in Jordan, 39% up in Syria, And this is 65 and older, but take a look now. Everything's like 95%. In Jordan, 99%. So most of these places have dramatically increased. Now, of course, on the one hand, that's good. More people can read, more people can write, but it just shows why there would be an age difference here. And there's a lot of young people. There are a lot of people being born. So the populations are swelling, and it tends to be more young people in these nations than older people because of the birth rate. And we see then this can also affect them. There also, it'd be interesting. I didn't find one. Would be the use of technology and how this is influencing things. But this is one thing that's influencing the Middle East as well. Maybe you didn't think about. Now here's something, religion. The Middle East is very complex religiously. And this is, as you can see, a very complicated looking map. And of course, a lot of the print on there is going to be too small for you to read. But I wanted you to get the general idea here through the colors. And if you look at this chart over here, you can see the colors are there. Primarily the greens. The greens are Sunni Muslims of various kinds. I guess it goes from sort of greens, yellows, and sort of a purple. And then these areas that are other colors, like you see here, well, Shias are dark green and Sunnis are light green. So you can see primarily the whole area is dominated by Muslims. But you see the dark green areas are Sunni or Shia Muslims. So you see them down in Yemen area. You see them in Iran. This is where they're a majority. You see in Iraq as well. And also over here in Lebanon and parts of Syria. This also makes things complicated, and it's not often, and even out here in Afghanistan. Why things get so complicated? Because, we, I guess, in the United States, we tend to think a Muslim is a Muslim. They're all kind of the same. Maybe some are more radical than others. But in fact, there's a lot of differences. And there's a major difference, and we've talked about this in class before, between the Shia Muslims, here the darker greens, and the Sunni Muslims, the sort of lighter green, lime greens, that sort of thing. And you can see the patchwork here. So a lot of times where there's conflicts, the conflicts are also being fueled by the differences between the Shias and the Sunni Muslims. So this makes it even more complicated, right? Add to that, of course, there are Christians in the area, although here you see it's listed as 3.9%, and those numbers have been falling because many Christians have fled the area. For example, Lebanon up here used to be a majority of the people there were Christians, and Palestine had about half, maybe 35-40% were Christians, and quite a few Christians in Syria and some in Iraq, but many of them have fled because of the conflict, and they're caught in the middle of that. Many of them are killed. Many of them are have left the area. So those numbers are declining. Jews, of course, Judaism is, as you can see, is this sort of orange color. And of course, it's in Israel primarily now, although there have been Jews, some Jews elsewhere. Many of them have fled. It's interesting also to see, I don't know if you can see it here, this red color, dark red, Zoroastrianism. What is that? Well, that is an ancient religion. You can see it, just little patches of it left here in Iran especially. And a lot of them have been persecuted and so forth. Zoroastrians see the world divided in light and darkness. Interesting group to have fire temples and things like that. So anyway, these are that area. And notice Wahhabism. This is a sort of grayish purple color. You see it in Saudi Arabia. These are very strict Muslims, very strictly interpret Islam. You see them over here at the UAE, some of them as well. So anyway, you can see, and we don't have time to sort of look at every detail here, but take a look at just the complexity of this religiously. So you've got that as a factor. Well, here's another thing that I think would be interesting. This map was made in December of 2017, somewhere in that neighborhood, but it shows the percentage of people within a country who support ISIS. We've heard a lot about ISIS, right? The Islamic State. It's in Syria and Iraq. And of course, it's been changing dramatically as it's a very fluid situation. But, most people have expressed that in the United States, they probably, 60, 70, 80% of people in the Middle East, they think probably support ISIS. Take a look at this. All these numbers are quite low. Only in Syria, which is the heart of ISIS, really, 21%. Lebanon, 0%. Iran, 0%. Jordan, 3%. Palestine, 6%. These numbers are surprising, I think, to most, say, Americans, because we would think it would be overwhelming support for ISIS. But ISIS, of course, is a radical group, and it's pushing for an independent Islamic state in Syria, Iraq, and I think they probably have dreams of having it spread across the Middle East, maybe across the world. But the number of people who are supporting this, pretty low. Even in Syria, where you would think it'd be very high, it's 21%. Okay, so again, our ideas about what's going on may also be in error, or we may exaggerate it. Now, here's another factor that I did list before, and that is oil. The darker areas here, you see all these sort of brown spots mostly, that's showing you where oil is available, where oil can be pumped, oil reserves. So notice that most of it is around this Gulf here. You see it in Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and so forth. Here are the 6 countries that have most of the oil: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, UAE, and Qatar, or Qatar. These are the areas that have almost all the oil. And down here in Oman, too, we could put into that. That means that most of the Middle East doesn't have much oil. And what oil they do have has to come mostly in shale, oil shale. It's pretty hard to get the oil out of there. But this has radically changed the Middle East because petroleum has been such a big commodity needed around the world, and it's brought so much wealth into, say, these 6 countries that they are now some of the wealthiest countries in the world. And that's what the other thing is on this map. You see a number below each name of a country. This number is the average, annual income per person. So notice how high it is here. Take, for example, Qatar. It's almost $100,000 a person there. And then notice Yemen down here, $1,400 a person. These two areas are only 350 miles apart, but they're worlds apart economically. So this shows you this is another complicated thing. Sometimes people in the United States think, well, everybody in the Middle East has oil. Everybody in the Middle East has a lot of money. Everybody in the Middle East supports radical Islam. Those things are really not true. This map shows you that. For example, look at Jordan, $5,400. I've spent a lot of time. Syria, $2,000 a year. Israel, $37,000 a year. Palestine, $2,900 a year. So, part of the let's say between Israel and Palestine, part of the conflict that might rise is income. Part of it's religion, of course. Part of it's politics. So it's a very complicated area. Now here's another map that I found that I think is useful. It just shows you, and we're going to talk more about the Israel-Palestine issue. And here is just a map that shows you that it is a global issue, right? Even though, as I put down here, Israel and Palestine combined are about 8,000 square miles. That's about the size of the state of New Jersey, right? But this issue about Israel and Palestine is in fact something that divides the world. Most of the western part of the world supports Israel and recognizes only Israel as a country, as an entity. So you see, United States, Canada, Mexico, and most of the Western European powers, and Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, Japan. And then you see those that only recognize Palestine are in the yellowish colors here, right? So you see how they are divided, the north part of Africa and the Middle East and so forth. And then those that recognize both. Well, there are those as well. So you've got a lot of the world recognizes both. A lot of the world recognizes only Israel. Smaller numbers recognize only Palestine. So this issue divides the world. Now, if you really want to get complicated, if you probably know that there's been fighting now in Syria for the past, I guess it's getting close to 15 years, over a decade. And this is very complicated. This map shows you that. I just want to say a few things about it. But this is Syria. This is the Syria right here. Turkey to the north, Israel over here, Jordan, right? Iraq over here. The ruler of Syria, and has been now for many years, is the Assad family. First it was a father, now the son, who rules Syria. They are linked to Iran because they are a part of Islam that is Shia, a derivation of Shia Muslim. And so they have had power and been ruling as dictators for now, 50, 60 years or more. And so you see them here in this reddish colors. These are the ones who are loyal to Assad. And there's been a fight back and forth. This map comes from November of 2015, so it's greatly changed since then. But just gives you a snapshot of what was going on. Then you see, I have it here, loyal to Assad, basically is in red. This is trying to take this stuff down here and make it simpler. The Kurds, you've probably heard of the Kurds. They're in these sort of yellowish green colors up here to the north in what we might call Kurdistan. But the Kurds are people that don't have a country. You see this line here, this is Syrian border, but the Kurds are across here in Turkey. They're over here in Iraq and so forth. They do not have their own country, but they have their own language and so forth. So they are virtually independent up here in the north. Now, the same kind of thing in Iraq today. So they are a big player in this as well. Then you have the colors that are in the green. These are the rebels. These are those who are fighting against Assad. And so they're really local, that is, they're Syrian, but they fight in opposing Assad. And then, of course, you have more players in this, in that you have the foreign forces. And really all that's listed here is Israel. Israel, of course, has had control of the Golan Heights down here in this blue for many years now, since the 1970s. And, you know, I don't see them turning that over anytime soon. And in fact, they have had some influence in the areas just surrounding the Golan Heights to try to keep this war in Syria, try to keep this conflict out of Israel. And then, of course, what's not shown on this map at all are the United States influence here. We don't have ground troops there, but we do have air strikes and things like that, where we have been highly, we have sent in advisors, that sort of thing. And of course, the Russians are doing the same thing. So if you take a look at this, also in those foreign, those outsiders that are there, it's listed in gray. The gray and then the black are all this gray is the Islamic State. They claim all this. A lot of this is desert, so there's not a lot there to take over, but there's Palmyra right there. And then all up the valley of the Euphrates River they control. Now, of course, this has greatly changed today, but this just shows you how complicated it is. You've got people coming in from the outside. These are what some people might call Islamic extremists. Yeah, they've come into the area and are controlling, especially along the rivers and the desert. Now, they have been pushed back greatly now by Assad, who's been aided by the Russians. So this map today would look a lot different. But it just shows you how complicated it is. Now, how did all this complex system get started? Well, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and as it became clear that the Ottoman Empire was going to disintegrate or fall apart, of course, the Europeans were looking to come in here because they had wanted this territory for a long time. Now, when it gets to what we might call the Middle East, this was their sort of idea that they had. Two diplomats got together, English and French, British and French. They had a secret agreement between them and sort of between the two countries that at the end of World War I, despite what Woodrow Wilson would want, victory without victors, that they were going to divide up the Middle East. By the way, the British already had really control of Egypt, and so they wanted to move into this area of in what are called the zones B and red zone. And of course, the French are going to move into these blue zones and the A zone. So this was sort of their idea, their agreement, going back to 1916, before the end of the war. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret agreement. And why do we bring it up? I mean, it never fully happened like this. But this set the parameters for what will happen. And a lot of artificially formed countries, really pretty artificial, we're going to come out of this. And notice they have down here Palestine, what we might call Palestine, Israel today, as a international zone that wouldn't really be controlled by either of them or have their own autonomy. This would be that. So that's interesting to see that. Of course, that never happened either. What does happen, of course, is that you see the French do take that area to the north. The British do take the area to the south. So here in this sort of darker color, orangey color, and the green color, you see that these is how it is. And so this connects. The British already controlled Egypt. They took control of Palestine, which was proved to be very difficult area. The Transjordan, Iraq. And also down here at this part that's sort of left out of this, you see it here, this area along the Gulf. What the British end up doing down here is they actually divide some of this up and give it to local emirs and royalty. For example, this is Kuwait. So when Saddam Hussein will later claim that, Kuwait was part of Iraq, he did have some historic call for that, because the British had delivered that over to the emirs here, and then the Gulf states had their independence down here. Of course, that's because they had a lot of oil. This is the other thing that affected it. All right, so we see then that what we would call Lebanon today and Syria were under the direct control of the French, and Israel, Jordan, and Iraq were under the direct control of the British. Saudi Arabia will be able to gain its independence in 1932. Nobody cared about Saudi Arabia. Why wasn't it included in this map? But and the previous one, look, they don't include it. Why? There's nothing there. It's desert, and there's nothing there. The only reason people got interested in it, well, besides people living there, is that oil was discovered, and the need for oil was growing. Okay, so we see then this is what happens. Now, these are called mandates, League of Nations mandates, 1920. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had been pushing for victory without victors. And one of the ways that he saw that is that no European power should expand their colonialism as a result of what happened in World War I. Of course, that's not going to work out that way, and they are going to take control of this. So what is the difference between a colony and a mandate? Not much. Just the name. It technically was under the control of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was very weak. The League of Nations, you might think of it as a forerunner to the United Nations. The United States never actually approved of the agreements at the end of World War I, and so the League of Nations never had the United States backing. And since they were one of the most powerful nations in the world, the League of Nations really didn't go anywhere. But this put the British then in control of a large chunk of the Middle East, and the French as well. You need to understand that to understand historically what's going to happen. As the Ottoman Empire declines, this guy here, who is the Sultan, will attempt some changes. Some changes were attempted in the 1870s. A new constitution of the Ottomans was put together in 1876. This Sultan, however, Hamid, Sultan Abdul Hamid, will stop many of these changes. He thought it was going too far and too fast. Now, other people are going to keep pushing for these kinds of things, and we're going to see they will resist the Sultan. This will be the rise of what's called the Young Turks. They're going to call for change. And so you might surprise you that the Turks not all Turks supported Ottoman Turkey or the Ottoman Turks. So these are nationalistic Turks. And they form what's called the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP. And they wanted a Turkish state, a nationalist state. So we see eventually the Sultan will get into trouble this way, and he will flee. He'll be going to exile, and the Turkish movement grows. And eventually we'll see a Turkish republic coming out of this. And World War I, of course, is the thing that will bring an end to the Ottoman Empire. If you remember, the Ottomans joined in with Germany, because Germany had always been their ally. So when World War I breaks out, they side with Germany. And of course, I hope you remember, that Germany lost that war. And when the Germans lost, so too the Ottoman Empire loses. Now, a person who will be influential in this for the British, in bringing down the Ottoman Empire and raising the hopes of local, especially Arabs, is this guy, T.E. Lawrence. Very interesting guy, T.E. Lawrence. He had been, and he studied at Oxford, he studied castles, medieval castles, crusader castles. He traveled around the Middle East as an undergrad. As part of his senior thesis, he walked all around the Middle East and visited castles, and he wrote his senior thesis, which is now published as a book. Anyway, interesting guy. He learned Arabic. He learned his way around. He then later went back to the Middle East after he graduated, became an archaeologist, and so learned even more about Arabic and the region that way. So when World War I breaks out, he is assigned to work with maps, cartography for the army, the British Army. And they soon realize he knows Arabic, he knows the area, and so they assign him to go to what today would be Jordan, Saudi Arabia, those areas, and to try to unify the Arab people in resistance to the Turks. And he had basically promised the Arab leaders that they could have independence. They could have an independent state. But even though I think that's what they told him and that's what he really believed, that's not what's going to happen. And at the end of World War I, the British seized the area, Palestine and the whole area there, and this leaves many of the Arabs feeling like they've been betrayed. Well, I guess they had been betrayed. And Lawrence of Arabia, of course, felt guilty for this for the rest of his life. So in October of 1918, when the Ottomans signed this armistice, the empire is collapsing, the Arabs feel betrayed, and the Europeans take over. Now, meanwhile, in Turkey itself, you can see we have this man will emerge as the leader of a new state, a new republic. The Turkish people didn't have too many heroes coming out of World War I, because they lost the war. But one hero they did have was this man, Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal was a war hero from World War I. He's also going to push for this Turkish state, an independent state of the Ottomans. And while others were coming in to carve up that Ottoman territory, including the British, the French, the Greeks, the Armenians, and so forth, he is wanting to maintain a Turkish control of the area. And of course, you see, he was successful. There is a country called Turkey today, and you know where it is, probably the Republic of Turkey. So when the Sultan flees in 1923, the last one, this is when the Turkish Republic begins. So Mustafa Kemal will become the first president. And of course, he will remain president his entire life. And he also gets a title, Ataturk, or Father Turk. He's considered to be the father of the Turkish nation and so forth. They would tell you he's like George Washington for them. And of course, he's very important in that regards. Now, of course, he is autocratic in many ways as well, and rules Turkey in a very forceful way. One of the things he wants to do is to modernize Turkey and to secularize it, to make it a modern secular state. Obviously, most people living there are Muslim, but he doesn't want it to be a Muslim state. So this makes it rather unique. The alphabet, he starts using the Western alphabet. Before this, they had used the Arabic script to write Turkish. Now they're going to use the alphabet, like we use, to write Turkish. I asked somebody one time, it seemed like a major undertaking to completely change the alphabet, change the way people were writing and so forth, because, Arabic goes from right to left, and they're now going to go from left to right. Everything about it is different. And the guy said, well, it wasn't that tough because most people didn't know how to read or write. So you could change the alphabet and the language without really affecting a lot of people. And then in school, they began to learn it that way. And so now that is the way it is. Of course, going to get rid of all the imperial titles, sultans, pashas, all that kind of stuff, and even their names. They changed their names. In the past, they had done their names more in a kind of Islamic way. Now it's going to be Western style, with a first name, a middle name, and a last name. Perhaps you just assume that's what everybody has around the world. But it's not. And Turkey will now take that too. So he's changing the alphabet. He's changing the titles. He's changing even your name, your names. He's going to change the law. The law is going to go from Islamic law, Sharia kind of law, to European law, Swiss laws. So it's a major overhaul. Also, even the way people dress change. They no longer can wear a veil or a hijab or a fez. These are prohibited. The fez and the veils are prohibited, and they take that quite seriously. One time, many years ago, when I was traveling in Turkey, a guy in our group bought a fez as a souvenir in a tourism place. He began to wear it around Turkey, and it ended up a guy at a restaurant called the police, and they were going to haul him away. And so our guide had to intervene, and the fez was wrapped up in newspapers and placed up in the top of the bus. And the guide said, don't get that out till you get home. So pretty serious about that. He begins to industrialize Turkey, building factories and so forth. But again, it is autocratic. All opposition is suppressed, forced out, imprisoned, things like that. So Turkey has changed. Now, what about Iran? Iran has an interesting history. It has a dynasty that forms. It's a part of the Ottoman Empire originally, but it begins to gain some independence and have its own dynasty, moving its capital to Tehran. And you can see the Qajar dynasty here. Because they are Shia Muslims, there are a lot of Shia Muslims there, and they grow in opposition to this dynasty, which was coming out of the Ottomans. The Ottomans are Sunni Muslims. The Shia Muslims begin to take over, and by 1906, as things are in upheaval with World War I, the Shah is forced to grant a Western-style constitution. The Russians get involved here. The British get involved here because, again, they're looking at the resources, they're looking geographically. Oil starts to become a factor at this time. And so we see that Iran, or Persia, as it's sometimes called, becomes an important state, a wealthy state. So we're going to see in 1908, that's when the oil is discovered, and this is when the West gets interested. So in 1921, the guy pictured up here, Reza Khan, will come to power in Iran, backed by Western allies like Britain and also by Russia. He's going to take over and set up a new dynasty called the Pahlavi dynasty. So, of course, with the coming of World War I, it had removed the Ottoman influence. And we're going to see a new development with a new kind of Shah, Reza Pahlavi, and he will come, you see his picture here. He comes to power, and he, as you can see, he's adopting you see the difference in their dress. He's dressing like a military leader. He's dressing like a Western leader. And he has lots of Western friends, allies in the United States and Britain and so forth. He gets quite wealthy. And, of course, corruption creeps in. So many of the Islamic leaders, religious leaders and so forth, see it as a corrupt regime, and they come to overthrow it. There's a revolution in 1979 led by this guy, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and they take over the area. Now, this will lead to much more radical government, Shia government, of course, now, the Islamic State of the Islamic Republic, I think they call it, of Iran, still led by Ayatollahs, not this man, he died, but others. And, of course, at that time in 1979, you might remember we talked about earlier, Jimmy Carter was president, and the American embassy is taken over. The staff there, the people there are held hostage, and they're held hostage for about a year or so during the campaign, Jimmy Carter's presidency. And we see, of course, this is one of the factors that led to the election of Ronald Reagan. And even today, of course, they're quite radical, and they're still in the news. They are sponsoring Hezbollah. They're sponsoring groups in Syria, in Palestine, in Lebanon. They have a lot of money, and they are radical, and so they are involved in a lot of this, and they're going to come up in the news for a long time to come. Now, let's move to Arab nationalism, and I want to talk about that because, as I mentioned before, when we mentioned Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabs wanted their independence. They wanted to be independent states, and they actually, Lawrence was coming from Egypt across here and talking Saudi Arabia and Jordan and stuff into these Arabs that live in this area to fight on the side of the British and to fight against the Turks. Well, they didn't like the Turks at all. They didn't know if they trusted the British, and I guess for good reasons they didn't as well. So we see that the Arabs had wanted their independence. They had thought this would come with the British, and this is sort of what had been promised to them. But the British support did not lead to, their British support did not lead to that, because the British come and take over Palestine, Iraq, and so forth. Saudi Arabia they leave alone because they didn't think anything was there. So this mandates league. So Iraq, Jordan, Palestine go to Britain, and Syria, Lebanon, and France go to France, as we have mentioned before. And so their dreams of independence and nationalism smashed. This is part of the reason why people in the Middle East get so upset. They seem so angry, is because they have been given promises that were never kept. And this is one big one, is that they would be independent, and then they weren't. So they tend not to trust people. As you remember, this is our League of Nations mandates, and so those areas are overlooked. Now, another major issue in the Palestine question, right, is what the British are going to do with Palestine. They end up having a lot of troubles there because, there are Arabs there, but Jews want to come in. The Zionists want to come in and control this area. So here is just a book cover, the Balfour Declaration, the origins of Arab-Israeli conflict, and certainly with conflict with the West. Well, most of the people living in Palestine, that area we might call Israel today, and Jordan, I suppose, they were Muslims. Oh, there were some Jews living there who had been there for a long time. But most of the Jews had left. Most of the Jews had fled, even back in the Roman times and so forth. And most of the Jewish population was actually in Europe. Because of persecution, they had moved around Europe, from Spain to Western Europe, out of Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and so forth. And so the Zionist movement then is calling for this territory. And now that Britain has control of it, they see their opportunity to go to the British government and appeal for a homeland for the Jews. And the foreign minister, his name was Lord Balfour, will make a promise to the Jewish people that they would have a homeland in what's called the Balfour Declaration. It's interesting, though, it says in his declaration that nothing that's done, the Jewish state, the Jewish people moving into this area should not harm the rights of non-Jews. And so we begin to see a lot of Jewish immigrants, people, Zionists, moving into Palestine, especially in the 1930s. It'll increase, but it's happening from the time the British take control of this area. Now here is Lord Balfour, and here is a summary that was printed of what it is and the statement itself. So you can see what it says. He sent a letter to Lord Rothschild. Lord Rothschild was a Jewish Zionist in Britain. He had a lot of influence there, and he had been pushing for this. And so he says, okay, I'm sending you this letter. I want you to pass it on to the Zionist Federation. And he's saying, I got pleasure to convey to you, His Majesty, that is the King of England, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. All right? So it says this: His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So it's interesting. I mean, it sets up really something that most people see cannot happen. How can you establish a homeland, a state, a Zionist state, and have people move into an area and have that not affect the people that are already living there? Okay, so this is again part of the problem of this whole thing, is you see the statement, clearly understood nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil religious rights of existing non-Jews, non-Jewish communities. So some people have then called Palestine a twice promised, the twice promised land. Some people call it the promised land. Some people call it the twice promised land. It was promised to the Zionist Jews, but it's also said, well, the Arabs don't have to leave. Everybody's just going to get along. Obviously, that has not worked. So we see now with, and this is our last screen for this one, Saudi Arabia will be formed. We've sort of talked about them, but the Saudi Arabia area, it wasn't on all these maps of the Europeans. The Europeans never came down into this area. Why? It wasn't because they were being nice to the Saudi Arabians or the people in Arabia. It's just they didn't see anything there that they really wanted. It was an area that even the local people call, like a big part of this, the empty quarter. There's nothing there. Most of it's desert. There are areas along the coast. Those are are there, and the coastal areas. And so what's going to happen is this man, King Ibn Saud, is going for several years to be pushing and fighting to control this area. And since the Europeans and others are staying out, this allows him to do this. So the Hejaz area, that's this area here. Najd, which you can see is over here. East Arabia, right, which is here, and parts of southern Arabia down here. So he's going to bring a lot of this territory together into Saudi Arabia. He's going to rule Saudi Arabia as a king, as a total absolute monarch, and then still today, those ruling Saudi Arabia are his relatives. It went from him. He had many brothers, through some of his brothers, through his nephews, and so forth. And so they control this area today. Now, again, most people wouldn't be talking much about Saudi Arabia and Ibn Saud probably, but of course oil was discovered here. And so we see the Ottomans pushed out. He pushes them out in the 20s. The Saudi Arabian kingdom starts in 1932. Well, the Americans are actually brought over some to look for water, because there's no water here. There's almost no fresh water, to try to drill and see if they can find water wells and that sort of thing. While they're doing that, they discover that no, there's no water. but there's oil. And of course, the Americans had been drilling for oil in places like Texas, which were very hot and dry. And so we're going to see that an agreement will be made with Saudi Arabia in 1938 between them and Standard Oil. This is called the Arab American Oil Company, Aramco. And basically, the Saudi Arabians didn't have any of the technology or equipment, but of course the Americans did. And so they said, okay, we'll make you a deal. We will come in, we'll pay for everything. We'll set up all the drill, all the wells, we'll haul everything away. We'll get everything, all the equipment, all the exploration. We'll do all of that. And then we will give you $1 per barrel of oil. It goes to you. And we will handle it all. We'll ship it out. We'll process it. We'll do everything. And of course, that was a great deal for them at that time because they had nothing. And this made Ibn Saud and his dynasty immediately, billionaires, within a couple of years because they're just pumping out barrel after barrel of 55-gallon barrels of oil. And of course, now the Saudi Arabians have taken over Aramco. They control it completely. Of course, I'm sure with still influence of America. But at any rate, this has changed the whole picture. So what I hope you see here now is how complicated the Middle East is. And we've looked at some of the hot topic areas. We'll look at some more again at a later time.